Marcus Thompson sat on the cold concrete steps of the county courthouse, his weathered hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His worn jacket, faded jeans, and scuffed boots told a story that most people walking past him assumed they already knew. Another homeless veteran down on his luck, another casualty of a system that had failed him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse plaza as people hurried past, their eyes carefully avoiding his gaze. Some clutched their purses tighter. Others crossed to the other side of the walkway. A few dropped loose change into the empty coffee cup beside him, the coins making a hollow sound that echoed his current circumstances. What they didn't know was that Marcus wasn't asking for money. He was waiting for his turn in family court, fighting for something far more precious than any handout, the right to see his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. 3 months ago, Marcus had lost his job at the construction company where he'd worked for 5 years. The economy had taken a downturn, and, as one of the newer hires, he was among the first to be let go. His savings ran out quickly, and, despite his best efforts to find new work, the bills kept coming. First, he lost his apartment. Then, his car was repossessed. Now he was staying at a homeless shelter downtown, sleeping on a narrow cot surrounded by dozens of other men who had fallen through society's cracks. His ex-wife Jennifer had wasted no time in filing for a modification of their custody arrangement. She argued that Marcus was unfit to care for Emma, that his homeless status made him a danger to their daughter's well-being. The court had temporarily suspended his visitation rights pending today's hearing. Marcus pulled out his phone, its cracked screen reflecting his tired face. He scrolled through photos of Emma, her gap-toothed smile at her school play, her excited face on Christmas morning, the two of them building sandcastles at the beach during better times. Each image was a reminder of what he was fighting for, what gave him the strength to get up each morning despite his circumstances. A group of lawyers in expensive suits walked past, their conversation about weekend golf plans and vacation homes. One of them glanced at Marcus with barely concealed disgust, making a comment under his breath about cleaning up the courthouse steps. Marcus had heard it all before. He'd been called everything from a deadbeat to a drug addict by people who knew nothing about his story. The truth was, Marcus was a decorated Navy SEAL who had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He'd earned a Bronze Star for valor during a mission that had saved the lives of 12 American soldiers pinned down by enemy fire. But, that Bronze Star, along with all his other military decorations, was tucked away in a storage unit that he could no longer afford to pay for. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd risked his life defending his country's values and freedoms, yet here he sat, treated as less than human by the very people he'd sworn to protect. His military training had prepared him for combat, for survival in hostile territory, for leadership under pressure. But nothing had prepared him for the shame and isolation of homelessness in the land he'd served. Marcus checked his watch, an old military timepiece that had survived everything from desert sandstorms to mountain combat. His hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, still 40 minutes away. He'd arrived early, partly out of nervous energy and partly because he had nowhere else to go. The shelter didn't allow residents to stay during the day unless they were sick, so Marcus spent most of his time walking the streets, looking for work, or sitting in public places like libraries and parks. A young mother walking with her toddler caught sight of Marcus and quickly scooped up her child, hurrying past with fearful glances over her shoulder. The little boy, maybe 3 years old, had been smiling at Marcus before his mother's reaction confused and frightened him. Marcus felt the familiar sting of being seen as a threat when all he wanted was to be a father to his own child. His lawyer, a overworked public defender named Sarah Chen, had been honest about his chances. Without stable housing or employment, the court was unlikely to restore his visitation rights. She'd advised him to consider agreeing to Jennifer's terms, supervised visits at a family center, with strict conditions and oversight. It would be better than nothing, she'd said, but Marcus knew it would also be admitting defeat. The courthouse steps were filling up with other people facing their own legal battles. An elderly man clutched foreclosure papers with shaking hands. A young woman nervously practiced her testimony for a restraining order hearing. Each person carried their own burden, their own crisis, their own hope for justice. Marcus thought about Emma's last words to him, spoken through tears during their final visit 3 months ago. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" she'd asked. He'd promised her it would be soon, not knowing then that home was about to disappear entirely. Now he wondered if he'd ever be able to keep that promise. The morning crowd was thinning as people settled into their workdays, leaving behind the courthouse's mix of hope and despair. Marcus finished the last sip of his cold coffee and stood up, stretching muscles that ached from sleeping on shelter cots and walking endless miles of city streets. He brushed off his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to face whatever judgment awaited him inside. In 30 minutes, he would walk into that courtroom and fight for his daughter with the same determination that had once carried him through enemy territory. The odds might be against him, but Marcus Thompson was a SEAL, and SEALs never surrendered. Even when the whole world seemed to have given up on them. Inside the courthouse, Marcus navigated the maze of hallways and security checkpoints with military precision. The polished marble floors and imposing portraits of judges created an atmosphere of authority that was meant to inspire respect, but, to Marcus, it felt more like intimidation. He'd faced enemy fire with less anxiety than he felt walking into family court. The waiting area outside courtroom 3B buzzed with quiet conversations between lawyers and their clients. Marcus spotted Jennifer sitting with her attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Hoffman who specialized in high-conflict custody cases. Jennifer looked polished and professional in her navy blue business suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She worked as a marketing manager for a pharmaceutical company, a stable job that paid well and came with excellent benefits. When Jennifer noticed Marcus, her expression shifted from nervous anticipation to something approaching pity mixed with disgust. She whispered something to her lawyer, who glanced over at Marcus and nodded with obvious satisfaction. They clearly felt confident about their chances. Sarah Chin arrived 15 minutes before the hearing, slightly out of breath and carrying an overstuffed briefcase. She was young, probably fresh out of law school, and Marcus could see the stress in her eyes. Public defenders handled dozens of cases at once, never having enough time to properly prepare for any of them. Still, she'd been kind to Marcus and seemed genuinely concerned about his situation. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "I've been better," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from the dry courthouse air. "What are our chances?" Sarah's hesitation told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. "Judge Morrison is fair, but he's also very concerned about child welfare. Without stable housing or employment, it's going to be an uphill battle. I've prepared character references from your former supervisor at the construction company and some fellow veterans, but Jennifer's lawyer is going to argue that Emma's stability should be the priority." Marcus nodded, understanding the reality while hating it. "What about my military service? Doesn't that count for anything?" "It absolutely should," Sarah said, "but the court's primary concern is your current circumstances, not your past achievements. We'll mention your service record, but we need to focus on concrete plans for getting back on your feet." The bailiff called their case, and Marcus felt his stomach clench as they filed into the courtroom. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made his eyes look larger than they actually were. He reviewed the case file with practiced efficiency while the court reporter prepared her equipment. Jennifer's lawyer stood first, presenting their case with polished confidence. He painted a picture of Marcus as an unstable influence in Emma's life, emphasizing his homelessness, unemployment, and what he called concerning behavior patterns. He claimed that Marcus had been seen arguing with staff at the homeless shelter, that he'd been drinking during the day, and that he'd failed to follow through on promises to find stable housing. Marcus felt his jaw tighten at these allegations. The argument at the shelter had been him standing up for an elderly veteran who was being bullied by younger residents. The drinking accusation was based on a single incident when someone had smelled alcohol on his breath during a morning shelter check, the result of using mouthwash from a sample bottle he'd found, since he couldn't afford toothpaste. The housing promises he'd supposedly broken were applications for subsidized housing that had waiting lists stretching for months. But he also knew that explaining these details would sound like excuses to the court. The truth was complicated and nuanced, while homelessness was simple and damning in its implications. Jennifer took the stand next, her voice wavering with what appeared to be genuine emotion. She talked about her fears for Emma's safety, about the little girl's confusion and distress over her father's situation. She described how Emma had started having nightmares and had been acting out at school since learning that her father was homeless. "I don't want to keep Emma from her father," Jennifer said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "But I can't expose her to an unstable environment. She needs consistency and security. She needs to know that the adults in her life can take care of themselves before they can take care of her." Marcus wanted to object, to point out that he'd taken care of himself and others under conditions far more challenging than civilian poverty, but he remained silent. He knew that outbursts would only confirm their narrative about his instability. When it was his turn to testify, Marcus walked to the witness stand with the same measured pace he'd once used approaching enemy positions. He spoke clearly and honestly about his circumstances, his efforts to find work, his love for his daughter, and his commitment to providing for her once he got back on his feet. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I understand that my current situation isn't ideal. But being homeless doesn't make me a bad father. I've never missed a visitation until the court suspended them. I've never put Emma in danger. I'm working every day to improve my circumstances, but these things take time." Judge Morrison listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. When Marcus finished, the judge asked pointed questions about his job search efforts, his plans for housing, and his support system. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, but he could feel the weight of his limitations with each response. The proceeding was interrupted when the courtroom door opened and a tall man in a crisp Navy uniform entered. Several people turned to look as Admiral Robert Hendricks made his way to a seat in the gallery. He was an imposing figure with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons that spoke of a distinguished military career. Marcus felt a surge of recognition mixed with confusion. Admiral Hendricks had been his commanding officer during his second deployment, a man whose respect Marcus had earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication to mission and team. But what was he doing here? The Admiral's presence seemed to shift the energy in the courtroom. Even Judge Morrison glanced up from his notes, clearly recognizing the significance of the uniform and rank. Jennifer and her lawyer exchanged puzzled looks, unsure of this new development. As the hearing continued with closing arguments, Marcus kept glancing back at Admiral Hendricks, who sat quietly observing the proceedings with the same intense focus he'd once brought to mission briefings. The Admiral's eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment, and there was something in his expression that Marcus couldn't quite read: recognition, certainly, but also what looked like determination. When Sarah Chen finished her closing argument with a plea for supervised visitation rights, Judge Morrison announced that he would take the matter under advisement and render his decision within 24 hours. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Admiral Hendricks remained seated, his gaze fixed on Marcus with unwavering attention. Marcus felt a flicker of hope mixed with apprehension. Whatever had brought his former commanding officer to this family court hearing, he sensed that his story was far from over. The wheels of military brotherhood, once set in motion, had a way of changing everything. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus lingered near the defendant's table, unsure whether to approach Admiral Hendricks or simply leave quietly. His former commanding officer solved the dilemma by standing and walking directly toward him, his polished shoes clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. "Petty Officer Thompson," Admiral Hendricks said, using Marcus's former rank. "I believe we need to talk." Marcus straightened instinctively, muscle memory from years of military service taking over. "Admiral Hendricks, sir. I didn't expect to see you here." The Admiral's weathered face showed years of command decisions and the burden of leadership, but his eyes held a warmth that Marcus remembered from their deployment together. "Walk with me, son." They exited the courthouse together, drawing curious glances from other people in the hallway. Outside on the steps where Marcus had spent his morning waiting, Admiral Hendricks turned to face him directly. "I was having breakfast at the Marriott downtown this morning when I saw someone I thought I recognized," the Admiral began. "A man sitting on these very steps, wearing an old military jacket. Something about his posture, his bearing, reminded me of a sailor I once knew. A brave young SEAL who saved 12 of my men during Operation Mountain Resolve." Marcus felt his throat tighten. Operation Mountain Resolve had been classified, the details known only to those who had been there. "Sir, I watched closer and saw this." Admiral Hendricks reached out and touched a small patch on Marcus's jacket collar, so faded and worn that most people would never notice it. It was the unit insignia from Marcus's SEAL team, barely visible after years of wear. This patch told me everything I needed to know about who you really are. The patch was something Marcus had forgotten he was even wearing. It had been sewn onto the jacket during his service and had somehow survived all the washing and wearing over the years, becoming nearly invisible against the faded fabric. Most people saw only a homeless man in worn clothes, but Admiral Hendricks had recognized the small symbol of brotherhood and sacrifice. I made some calls, the Admiral continued. I learned about your situation, your struggles since leaving the service. I also learned about today's custody hearing. That's when I decided I needed to be here. Marcus felt overwhelmed by a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Admiral, I appreciate you coming, but I don't want your pity. I've made my own mistakes, and this isn't about pity, petty officer. This is about honor and taking care of our own. Admiral Hendricks's voice carried the same commanding tone that had once motivated Marcus through impossible missions. Do you remember what I told you after Mountain Resolve? When you pulled those wounded soldiers from that burning vehicle under enemy fire? Marcus did remember. The Admiral had found him later that day, sitting alone and shaking from adrenaline and shock. You said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. Exactly. And you showed that courage every day you served. The same courage that got you through combat is the courage that's kept you fighting for your daughter. The Admiral paused, studying Marcus's face. But courage alone isn't always enough. Sometimes we need backup, and sometimes we need intel that we don't have access to on our own. Admiral Hendricks pulled out his phone and made a call. Bradley? It's Bob Hendricks. Yes, the same Bob Hendricks whose nephew you helped with that DUI last year. There was a pause. I need you to do something for me. That custody case you just argued? I need you to withdraw your motion and recommend supervised visitation for the father. Immediately. Marcus watched in amazement as his former commanding officer spoke with quiet authority. He could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was clear that Bradley Hoffman, Jennifer's high-powered attorney, was not arguing with Admiral Hendricks. I understand you have an obligation to your client, the Admiral continued, but you also have an obligation to truth and justice. The man you just painted as an unfit father is a decorated Navy SEAL who saved 12 lives in combat. He's not homeless because he's lazy or irresponsible. He's homeless because sometimes good men fall through the cracks of a system that fails them. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Admiral Hendricks calmly but firmly explaining Marcus's service record and the circumstances that had led to his current situation. When he hung up, he turned back to Marcus with a slight smile. Bradley Hoffman is ambitious, but he's not stupid. He knows that going after a war hero in family court would be career suicide if it became public knowledge. He's going to call Jennifer and recommend that they accept supervised visitation starting immediately. Marcus felt stunned. Sir, you didn't have to do that. I don't want special treatment just because this isn't special treatment. This is what should have happened from the beginning if people had bothered to look past the surface. Admiral Hendricks clapped a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. But we're not done yet. You can't raise your daughter from a homeless shelter, no matter how many character witnesses you have. The Admiral pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. There's a veteran-owned construction company that does a lot of work for the Navy. They need experienced workers, and they specifically hire veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life. The owner, Mike Rodriguez, is expecting your call this afternoon. Marcus stared at the card, feeling like he was in some kind of dream. Admiral, this is too much. I can't accept you can and you will. And you'll do it because that little girl needs her father, and because this country owes you better than sleeping in a shelter. The Admiral's tone left no room for argument. Mike Rodriguez was a Marine who struggled with similar issues when he got out. He built his company specifically to help veterans like himself, like you. It's not charity, it's brotherhood. Admiral Hendricks reached into his jacket and pulled out another item, a hotel keycard. You're staying at the Marriott tonight, room 412. I've already paid for a week. Use the time to clean up, get some decent clothes, and prepare for your job interview. There's also $500 in cash on the dresser for immediate expenses. Marcus felt his eyes fill with tears for the first time in months. Sir, I don't know how to repay this. You repay it by being the father your daughter needs, by rebuilding your life, and by remembering that we take care of our own. When you're back on your feet, you find another veteran who needs help and you pass it forward. Admiral Hendricks stood at attention and saluted Marcus, a gesture of respect between warriors. Semper Fi, Petty Officer Thompson. Marcus returned the salute with trembling hands, feeling his pride and dignity returning for the first time in months. As Admiral Hendricks walked away, Marcus looked down at the business card in his hand. For the first time since losing his job, he dared to believe that things might actually get better. The small, faded patch on his jacket collar had changed everything. In a world that had forgotten his value, one man had remembered who he really was beneath the surface of his circumstances. Marcus touched the patch gently, understanding now that it represented more than just military service. It represented a bond that transcended rank, time, and circumstance. Tomorrow he would start rebuilding his life. Tonight, he would sleep in a real bed for the first time in months, and dream about the day when Emma would run into his arms again. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his new apartment, watching Emma arrange her stuffed animals on the twin bed he'd assembled the night before. The one-bedroom apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, safe, and, most importantly, it was home. Emma's excited chatter filled the space as she explored every corner of what would be her weekend sanctuary. Daddy, can we put my drawing on the refrigerator? She asked, holding up a crayon masterpiece that depicted the two of them holding hands under a rainbow. Of course, sweetheart. That's what refrigerators are for, Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. He'd waited 6 long months for this moment, Emma's first overnight visit to his new place. The transformation had been remarkable but not easy. Mike Rodriguez's construction company had indeed offered Marcus a job, starting him as a general laborer and quickly promoting him to crew supervisor when his military leadership skills became apparent. The work was hard and the hours were long, but the steady paycheck had allowed Marcus to save money for an apartment deposit and furniture. More importantly, the job had given him back his sense of purpose and dignity. His co-workers, many of them fellow veterans, understood his journey in a way that civilians couldn't. They'd become his support network, his brothers in arms in the battle to rebuild civilian lives after military service. The legal victories had come gradually. First, supervised visitation had been restored, allowing Marcus to see Emma for 3 hours every Saturday at a family center downtown. Jennifer's lawyer had indeed withdrawn their motion for complete termination of parental rights, though Jennifer herself had remained skeptical of Marcus's ability to turn his life around. Those early visits had been awkward and painful. Emma was hesitant at first, confused by the sterile environment of the family center and the presence of a court-appointed supervisor who took notes on their every interaction. But, gradually, their bond had reasserted itself. Emma began to relax, to laugh, to remember why she'd always been Daddy's girl. As Marcus proved his reliability, showing up on time for every visit, finding stable housing, maintaining steady employment, the court had gradually expanded his rights. Unsupervised visits came first, then extended day visits, and, finally, the overnight visits that had begun just last month. Jennifer had fought each expansion initially, but even she couldn't argue with the evidence of Marcus's transformation. He'd completed parenting classes, attended counseling sessions, and demonstrated unwavering commitment to his daughter's well-being. More importantly, Emma's happiness during their time together was impossible to deny. Daddy, will you read to me tonight? Emma asked, settling onto the small couch with a picture book about a little girl and her father. Every night that you're here, Marcus promised, sitting beside her and pulling her close. She smelled like Johnson's baby shampoo and graham crackers, scents that brought back memories of bedtime routines from before his world had fallen apart. As Emma dozed against his shoulder, Marcus reflected on the phone call he'd received the week before. Admiral Hendricks had called to check on his progress, something the Admiral did every few months without fail. The older man had become an unofficial mentor, offering advice on everything from career advancement to single parenting. "I always knew you had it in you," the Admiral had said. "The same qualities that made you an exceptional SEAL, persistence, courage, loyalty, those don't disappear just because you take off the uniform. Sometimes they just need the right circumstances to emerge again." Admiral Hendricks had also shared news that filled Marcus with pride and purpose. Several other veterans in similar situations had been helped by the network that had formed around Marcus's story. Word had spread through military and veteran communities about the Admiral's intervention, inspiring other officers to look out for struggling former service members. A formal nonprofit organization was being established to provide emergency assistance, job placement, and legal support for homeless veterans. "You started something bigger than just your own recovery," the Admiral had explained. "Your story reminded people that behind every homeless person is a human being with dignity, and sometimes a hero whose service we've forgotten." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his lowest point had become the foundation for something larger than himself. The faded patch that Admiral Hendricks had recognized on his jacket collar was now framed and hanging on his apartment wall, a reminder of how far he'd come and how brotherhood could transform lives. Jennifer arrived promptly at 6 o'clock Sunday evening to pick up Emma, just as she had every weekend for the past 2 months. The interactions between Marcus and his ex-wife had evolved from hostile to civil to something approaching friendly. Jennifer had gradually come to understand that Marcus's homelessness hadn't been a moral failing but a consequence of circumstances beyond his control. "How was your weekend, baby?" Jennifer asked Emma, kneeling down to zip up her overnight bag. "It was awesome. Daddy made pancakes shaped like butterflies, and we went to the park, and he's teaching me how to tie my shoes the Navy way," Emma bubbled with excitement. Jennifer glanced at Marcus with something that might have been respect. "Thank you for having her ready on time. I know it's hard when she has to leave." "It gets easier," Marcus replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Same time next weekend?" "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that." Jennifer stood up, her expression serious but not unkind. "Emma's been asking if she can spend more time here. I was thinking maybe we could discuss extending the weekends, maybe Friday nights too." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you serious? You've proven yourself, Marcus. You've shown that you can provide stability and love for Emma. She's thriving during your time together, and honestly, I think she needs more of her father in her life." After Jennifer and Emma left, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the signs of his rebuilt life, framed photos of Emma, military commendations he'd retrieved from storage, books about child psychology he'd been reading to become a better father. The silence was peaceful rather than lonely, filled with the promise of Emma's return and the knowledge that he'd fought his way back from rock bottom. He picked up his phone and scrolled to Admiral Hendricks' number. Their conversations had evolved from crisis intervention to friendship, from desperate gratitude to mutual respect. The Admiral answered on the second ring. "Marcus. How did the weekend go?" "Better than I could have imagined, sir. Emma's asking to spend more time here, and Jennifer's actually considering it." Marcus paused, still amazed by how dramatically his life had changed. "I keep thinking about that morning on the courthouse steps, when I thought I'd lost everything. I never imagined I'd be here." "I did," Admiral Hendricks said simply. "I saw it in that faded patch, in the way you carried yourself even when the world had written you off. Heroes don't stop being heroes just because they're going through hard times. They just need someone to remind them who they really are." After the call ended, Marcus walked to his bedroom window and looked out at the city lights below. Somewhere out there, another veteran might be sleeping in a shelter, sitting on courthouse steps, fighting battles that civilians couldn't understand. Tomorrow, Marcus would make some calls, offer some help, pass forward the brotherhood that had saved his own life. The small patch that now hung framed on his wall had taught him something profound. We are never truly alone as long as we remember who we are and where we come from. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to remember that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a brotherhood forged in service, strengthened by shared struggle, and made unbreakable by the willingness to never leave anyone behind. Emma's drawing was already centered on the refrigerator, her rainbow bright against the clean white surface. Next weekend, he would teach her how to fold an American flag properly, how to show respect for the symbol of the country her father had served. And, someday, when she was old enough to understand, he would tell her about the morning when a faded patch and an admiral's recognition had changed both their lives forever.